देखिए जी, हम जो PID में वेबिनार करते हैं, we do it primarily to teach our people from the best of the world. We've got Nobel Prize winners, we've got excellent people from Pakistan. हमारी कोशिश ये होती है कि हम लोगों को नई इन्फॉर्मेशन दे सके, but unfortunately हमारे लोग टिकटॉक में लगे रहते हैं, कुछ नहीं सीखते. हमारे स्टूडेंट्स भी कुछ नहीं सीखना चाहते. हमारी सोसाइटी एक डम सोसाइटी बनती जा रही है, बट क्या करें, दैट्स आवर फेट. तो जी, ये कहते हुए मैं सिर्फ ये कह दूं कि जी ये वेबिनार अगेन वी ट्राई एंड ब्रिंग द बेस्ट टू यू. आज हमारे पास हैं सैयद सरदार अली. सैयद सरदार अली इज द chairperson of the Crescent Foundation. He's also the chairperson of the Apex Consulting Service. Mashallah, a well accomplished Pakistani professional, a dying breed. So सरदार साहब पता नहीं कितने रह जाएंगे हमारे जाने के बाद, क्योंकि इस मुल्क में तो प्रोफेशनल कदर ही कोई नहीं रह गई, ना कोई चाहता. सिर्फ मिनिस्टर चाहते हैं हम, और मिनिस्टर साहब जो मर्जी ड्रामा कर ले, सुबह उठ के रेलवे के बन जाए, रात को बन जाए कॉमर्स के, परसों बन जाए पेट्रोलियम के. ठीक है, जैसे सेक्रेटरी है वैसे मिनिस्टर. ये हमारी दुनिया बन गई है. तो खैर, सरदार साहब बात करेंगे आज द इंडस्ट्रियल सिविलाइजेशन, हाउ द रेस्ट कैन कैच अप विद द वेस्ट. और सरदार साहब इसका सबटाइटल मैं सजेस्ट कर दूं, हाउ वी विल नेवर कैच अप विद द वेस्ट. सरदार साहब, ओवर टू यू, गो अहेड.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. First of all, thank you for the invitation, giving me the opportunity to present my ideas, and also thank you for this generous introduction. It's been exactly 1 month since Pakistani celebrated the 75th anniversary of their independence. Unfortunately, at that occasion, the mood was of utter hopelessness. The feeling that no reforms are going to work, that poverty, unemployment, corruption, lawlessness, and chaos will continue to rise, and that democracy will not be able to solve any of our problems. But we are not alone in this sense of foreboding. Majority of the poor living in sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, Middle East, and North Africa, and poor countries of Asia, they feel similarly trapped, unable to find a path to the kind of good life they know is enjoyed by the citizens of the Western countries. And unfortunately, development assistants, development professionals, they have also not been of much help since the beginning of the discipline in 1950s. Inequality among nations continues to rise. One of the richest countries, Luxembourg, is about 150 times richer than the poorest country, Burundi. Despite $1 trillion in development assistance to Africa over the last 50 years, the continent is now host to 75% of the world's poor, compared to only 10% in 1970s. Latin America, despite 200 years of independence, has not been able to make democracy work. On the other hand, a country that broke all the rules on the book has lifted 800 million people out of poverty over the last 40 years, and has done so without being dependent upon aid and without even subscribing to the Western model of democracy. Certainly, there is something amiss in the very framework we employ in the discipline of development. My short book, a treatise, tries to understand the nature of current human condition by asking 3 questions. What were the reasons behind the rise of the West? Why, despite centuries of efforts, the rest have not been able to catch up with the West? Despite living in an era when ideas, goods, and capital can flow almost instantaneously across the globe. And the third question, can poor countries have a chance to get out of this quagmire? And if they do, what are the steps that they would have to take in order to join the ranks of the developed countries? My book has a very simple thesis. The basic idea is that modern industrial West is not just a new civilization, but a new kind of civilization. It represents a quantum leap, a change in the system of society and system of production from agriculture to industry. Not just a quantitative, but a qualitative change. The first ever paradigm shift in the very concept of civilization, of human civilization. And if we are able to grasp this one central idea, then seemingly inexplicable events over the last 1,000 years begin to make sense. For example, why was West able to rise when it did? And why was it able to rise so exponentially? And of course, then this analysis of the last 1,000 years could also lead us to a general path that poor countries then would have to follow to get through the same process of transformation. Let's come to the first part, the rise of the West. I'll begin the story of the rise of modern human societies from the rise of anatomically modern human beings 200,000 years ago. For 190,000 years, humans lived as hunters and gatherers. The principle of production was reliance upon nature, and the function and the factors of production was their labor. And the system of society was also equivalently rudimentary. Tribes, there was no formal economy, and the religious beliefs were animistic. Then about 12,000 years ago, agriculture started to emerge simultaneously and independently in Mesopotamia, in Egypt, in Yangtze River in China, in Indus Valley in India, Pakistan, and then in Mesoamerica in Africa. Agriculture changed the principle of production from simple dependence to imitation of nature. And to the factors of production was added land besides labor. This system of production grew in complexity and productivity over the next 5,000 years. And after 5,000 years, we saw the rise of complex human societies, starting with Sumer in the Mesopotamian river delta. The important thing to note from our point of view is the sequence. First came the rise of the system of production, and then the rise of the system of society. And together, these two systems form the format of human civilization. And this format has been followed by all the known civilization, about 19 to 20 civilizations that we know of, up until to our present day, with the exception of modern West. This civilization went through Neolithic to Bronze Age. Bronze Age had a collapse. And when these societies emerged after the Dark Ages, at the end of the collapse of the Bronze Age, from about 800 BC to 200 BC, there was another revolution, the cognitive revolution, that was again independent, yet near simultaneous in all the major population centers. During this axial age, we see in China the emergence of Taoism, legalism, and Confucianism. We see in India the emergence of new texts of Brahmanism. We see Jainism and Buddhism. In the Middle East, we see the rise of monotheism. And in Europe, we see the rise of philosophical rationalism. The modern world in which we live, the modern world of cell phones, organ transplant, constitutional democratic states, that traces its roots to the philosophical rationalism of Greeks. How did we get from there to here? This is the story of 2,000 years and 2,600 years rise of the modern West. Greek were conquered by Romans in 146 BC, but the Greek culture, Greek thought, Greek architecture, Greek philosophy, Greek learning, they were adopted by the patrician class of the Rome, and the Roman Empire became the transmission mechanism of Greek culture and Greek learning. But then Christianity overtook Rome, and we have about 1,000 years of what Europe calls itself the Dark Ages. Europe came out of the Dark Ages in 13th century, the event known as the Renaissance. From the Renaissance in the 13th century up until the First World War in 1914, it was in these during 7 centuries that Europe transformed to the society and the production that we see as of today. And this I have tried to summarize in the bottom row of the slide. This, of course, is a very long and complex series of transformations spanning centuries. But there's a pattern in this emergence. And there are 3 clear spheres in which transformation took place in this succession. First came the social awakening. The benchmarks were the Renaissance, Reformation, and this trend coalesced in the form of secular humanism in the middle of the 19th century. The second great transformation was the political reordering of Europe. It started with Reformation, which was followed by civil wars, and beginning from the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, you see the rise of secular, sovereign, and territorial nation states. Then you had revolutions in England, in United States, in France, and this reordering of Europe coalesced in the European tradition of constitutional liberalism. And the third fundamental transformation was the rise of empirical and mathematical science, beginning with the Copernican revolution. Then you had Newton and other scientists such as Leibniz, Faraday, Robert Boyle, and the practical inventions of James Watt's steam engine in the last quarter of the 18th century. And this led to the Industrial Revolution from 1870 in 2 phases, ended in 1914. And finally, you have what is the economic boom that we can measure and we can envy. As this European society has coalesced, it has 3 characteristics, and these characteristics have policy implication for poor countries. The first characteristics of this new system of society and system of production is that it is not an advanced variant of the old system of society and old system of production. It represents a quantum change, a qualitative change, a paradigm shift. It is something completely new that had not existed before. We can give 2 evidence, first from history and second for economy. Had it been just a continuation of the past, then the chances of modernity rising would have been better from China, from India, from Muslim Middle East, or from the Byzantine Empire, the eastern part of the Roman Empire that had survived the collapse and lasted 1,000 years long. But modern society and industrial production did not rise from any of these known cultural and population centers. Instead, it arose from what could best be described as the backwaters of Western Europe. The economic argument for this being absolutely unprecedented phenomena is that when this system of society and production started to rise in the 18th century, it did not just rise linearly. It rose exponentially. And that's why we see the emergence of the phenomenon of great acceleration and the great divergence. Had it just been in continuity of the past, then you would have seen growth, but not at the level of quantum that we see, as we do see in the great acceleration and the great divergence phenomenon. And the policy implication for the rest is that if you just try to reform the old system of society and production, you're not going to get anywhere. You really would have to go through a series of transformation, a fundamental transformation, really a quantum leap to catch up with the West. The second feature of this modern human existence is the sequence of its evolution. First, you see society, a different system of society emerging that formed the base, and then that society led to the rise of a different system of production. Now, this is a complete reversal of relationship between production and society as we observed in the rise of the agriculture form of civilization. Their system of production rose first, and then system of society later. But here you have first the rise of a system of society, then which in turn gave the birth to a new system of production. Which means that if the rest of the countries have to catch up with the West, then they would have to follow a sequence which can be briefly described that they would first have to modernize, and only then will they be able to industrialize. And if you do not get the sequence right, you'll never be able to catch up with the West. The third feature of this European system of production and society is that the factors of production are now knowledge, labor, and raw material, not capital. And the policy implication is that if poor countries only relied upon importing capital in terms of development assistance, grants, or remittances from their citizens living abroad, then this capital is going to lead neither to a rise in production or change in the system of society. You would have to rely upon scientific and rational knowledge and train a different kind of labor in order to be able to gain the ranks, to join the ranks of the industrialized societies. Now, once Europe had transformed itself, it acquired immense power. And this power was not based upon exogenous factors, but upon the changes that had taken place in Europe endogenously. I know we in the third world countries blame European colonizers for exploitation that took place during the period of colonization. And of course, there was exploitation, there were abuses. But those factors, that colonization or supposedly the transfer of capital or wealth from the colonized country to the colonizers, was not the reason for the phenomenal and miraculous rise of the Europe. I know it's a contentious issue, but there are other arguments to support that, and we can discuss that during the question and answer session. But Europe did gain ascendancy, and human societies for the last 3 centuries, the history of human societies has basically been their response to the rise of the West. In the second part of the treatise, I look at the efforts of 5 sub-societies that have tried to catch up with the West during the last 300 years. Peter the Great and Russian quest for modernity, Meiji Restoration and the modernization of Japan, the emergence of modern China, opening of Egypt by the West, and finally the birth of the Turkish Republic. Today we have time only to discuss one of these 5 examples. Let's take the example of China. How did China become modern and is now the envy of the world, particularly of the third world who would like to copy the success of Chinese model? The story of the rise of China started in 1793, and from then onwards up until 2022, it unfolded in 5 phases. The first phase was from 1793 to 1860. During this period, British came knocking at the door of Imperial China. They were denied the rights to trade. They resorted to smuggling opium into China, and there were 2 opium wars. China lost both. And for the first time, Chinese realized that strength in numbers is not the success, is not the guarantee to success in battle. After these wars, generals that had seen the power of the West firsthand, they turned scholars and tried to catch up with the West by grafting Western technology, military techniques, armament production onto the old system of Chinese society. This period is called the self-strengthening movement in China. That lasted from 1860 to 1912. That also failed. And China lost again, this time not to the West, but to modernizing Japan in 1894, 1895. After this failure came the third period in the rise of modern China from 1912 to 1949. Revolutionary Sun Yat-sen did away with the 2000 or imperial system of China. China had a constitution, China had a president, and China held election in 1913. But these changes did not go very well, particularly the political change. During these decades, particularly from 1927 to 1937-38, there was, this is called the golden decade or the Nanking decade. China did experience political, social, and economic change, but no real fundamental transformation of the society. And the rewards of these changes were confined to very small section of the elite residing in the major city centers, Beijing and Shanghai. 90% of the Chinese who were peasants living in the countryside, their lives remained untouched. Their mental habits, their daily routines, the way they looked at nature, the way they related to each other, the way they related to authority, the way they looked at progress or the past, all these old habits, customs, rituals, belief systems, they continued the same way as they had for the past 2,000 years. This gave the opportunity to the communists, and thus we entered the 4th period in the rise of modern China from 1949 up until the death of Mao Zedong in 1976. Mao dismantled the Chinese civilization, its major pillar as they have evolved over the last 2,000 years. Its economic institutions, its political institutions, its social institutions, and its cultural institutions, and swept aside the debris of history and freed the Chinese people, Chinese mind, from the bondage of the past. It liberated them mentally, socially, culturally. By the time Mao died, China was still a poor society. But if you look deeply at its Human Development Index, then the indicators that relate to the health, China had caught up more or less with the West. And the difference between the per capita GDP and its health indicator was very large. Similarly, there was large gap. The per capita GDP was very low, but China had very good attainment in the sector of education. Similarly, China had caught up in terms of alleviation of crimes. China was unified. And above all, China during these decades had acquired the apparatus of a modern state. Now, this state apparatus could make policies and could enforce them in the remotest village of China with equal authority and equal effectiveness. And this apparatus of a modern state was provided to China by the Communist Party of China. So by the time Mao died, China had caught up socially, China had caught up politically. Of course, China had not yet caught up economically. That came after the death of Mao, when Deng Xiaoping in 1978 became the paramount leader and started the era of reform and opening up. And from then onwards, we see 4 decades of Chinese growth, growing at about double-digit rate, 9.44% to be exact. And that growth lifted 800 million people out of poverty. But the same paramount leader, Deng Xiaoping, that led the reforming opening up period, in 1989 cracked down upon the democracy protesters. In a call to American President Bush, Deng said that if we were to hold multi-party elections tomorrow, China would be plunged into full-scale civil war. If that is the history of the rise of Europe, and that is the history of the rise of modern China, then what can other countries do to catch up with the West? And if not with the West, then certainly, a very recent example of Asian extract of the Chinese miracle. The third part, the normative power, what should we do? Of course, is subject to interpretation. And certainly, there'll be many things that would probably be politically incorrect, particularly in an academic setting. But with this caveat, I'll start with asking the most pernicious of all the questions: that can poor countries of the world make this transition from archaic to modern, from agriculture to industry, by following the Western model of adult, universal, multi-party democracy? And history gives us the clear answer that it cannot be done. And there are reasons that are structural in nature. The first reason is that if modern system of society and modern system of production is a break from the past, is not just the continuity of the past, then the modern cannot be built unless the old is destroyed. But in this kind of democracy that has been followed by the post-colonial societies in the last 200 years, in some cases, the elite of the old system, of the old societies, they capture power. And once they capture power, they would never agree to self-liquidation. It is their interest to perpetuate the old order, the old system of society, and the old system of production. Second, in an adult franchise democracy, you would never build a consensus about future and about progress. Majority in any society always looks to the past for guidance. And third, even if you are able to make some economic gains, then any democratic system that is based upon adult franchise will buckle under the pressure for instant redistribution of those gains, even before those economic gains had a chance to become sustainable. It is because of these structural reasons that Western multi-party adult franchise democracy has failed the rest in their efforts to catch up with the West. So if that is not the path to a prosperous life, then in the famous question asked by Lenin in 1902, what is then to be done? What can these poor countries do to catch up? And the story of the efforts of the West over the past 3 centuries does give us some clue. It points to 7 stages through which these societies would have to pass through to join the ranks of the modern world. The first of the step is the creation of a surrogate state. A surrogate state is a concept unknown to the West because the West did not need it. West has a concept of a political party. A political party, basically a political faction that engages in the battle to gain power. And once it has gained power, it forms a government. But that's a very limited concept, at least when it comes to the condition and the requirements of the rest of the societies. A surrogate state is a political organization. It is an ideological organization. It is also an administrative organization whose task it is to give birth to a modern nation state, to a rational society, and to an industrial economy. It would have to lead the nation from all those series of fundamental transformation that took centuries to accomplish in the West, and under the guidance, leadership, and steady hand of the surrogate state, the rest of the societies would have to go through these changes, not just in centuries, but in a matter of decades. This would be the function of the surrogate state. A surrogate state would have to learn from the West, as well as rely upon its own cultural heritage, its own language, its own history, particular circumstances, its sense of identity, to form a thesis, to form a basis of identity on which to base all subsequent changes. Meiji Japan had Meiji oligarchs. Russia had the Bolsheviks. Turkey had CHP, and China has Communist Party of China, the quintessential example of what a surrogate state is. The second stage is the dismantling of the old order of society. This is the most difficult part. It is the most overlooked part, but it is also the most essential part. And during this phase, the old economic, political, and social, for the most part, social and for the most part, cultural institution would have to be dismantled. In the third stage, by looking into the nation's own history, its religious traditions, its cultural traditions, and its ambitions for the future, the surrogate state would have to distill a new sense of national identity a new concept of progressive citizenship. And on the basis of this new sense of pride in belonging to a modern nation, the surrogate state would have to then build modern institutions that are needed for the functioning of a modern nation state. Either this institution would have to be built anew, or the old institution would have to be remodeled. And these institutions include standing army, bureaucracy, judiciary, education system, municipal governance, and so on and so forth. The next stage would be the acquisition of human and physical capital. Human capital would mean training an entire generation of engineers, trained and disciplined workforce, managers, technicians, doctors, professors, and acquisition of physical capital would mean all the paraphernalia that is required in the modern world to make an industrial society work. During the agriculture mode of production, you needed land, you needed irrigation, you needed simple metallurgy, and those were the requirements of the age. Those were the physical capital that you needed at that time. Now you need a different form of physical capital. Physical capital in the form of communication network, energy supplies, modern irrigation, roads, bridges, ports, urban centers, airports, and so on and so forth. Once nation has acquired human capital and physical capital, and as you can well imagine that during these stages, there would not be much rise in the per capita GDP. There'd be changes that would not be apparent in the surface, at least they would not be measurable. And since they would not accompany the rise in GDP, this would be an era of intense hardship for the society. And you see the same phenomena in Japan during the Meiji Restoration. You see the same phenomena in Russia before World War II, and you see the same phenomena under Mao Zedong. The fifth stage would be state-led industrialization. West has had many centuries to develop industries that form the backbone of modern industrial production. And any nation that wishes to catch up with the West would have to somehow establish those basic industries as well. And since capital, technology, management skills, international exposure would not be available to the private entrepreneurs during these initial stages, the state would have to take the lead. They would have to take the lead in basic industries such as metallurgy and iron and steel, non-ferrous metals, industrial chemicals, engineering, construction, large banking and finance, and so on and so forth. And once those basic industrial and services infrastructure is in place, then on the sixth stage, you would then have to encourage the private sector, both through policy incentives as well as through market mechanisms, and gradually bring about conditions so that the share of GDP that comes from the private sector should eventually overtake the share of the GDP that it ascribes to the state sector. And these six stages can take about 25 to 35 years from about 2 generations. During these decades, your economy would have been integrated into the international value chains, trade networks, and politically, the nation would have become a part of the all the treaties, as well as a respectable member of the International Committee of Nations. Now the question is that will, at the end, once these changes have taken place, will all the nations have to then follow the path of multi-party universal adult franchise democracy, as was predicted in the start of the 90s in the famous phrase of end of history and the last man? The qualities that we see in the governance structure of the modern world are that of stability, adaptability, progressiveness, equity, and meritocracy. So if we can fulfill, or any system of governance that can fulfill those conditions, would serve its people much better than the kind of system that the poor countries is running up until now. Now, these are the 5 broad general steps or stages. And of course, each society, depending upon its own heritage, culture, history, religious tradition, would have to make changes. But the core would remain the same, and the sequence would remain the same. No matter whether your nation is in Latin America, Africa, or Asia, or whether you are Buddhist, Christian, or Muslim. With this, Dr. Sab, I'll close my comments, and I'll thank you not only just for inviting me, but also for bringing to us research from all across the world and doing a public service to the people of Pakistan. Thank you very much. That's the end of my comments.
Sardar Sahab, thank you very much. I think the way I look at it, most important part of your presentation, which I think is very valuable, very interesting, great overview of the world history, and lots of interesting things to say there. But one thing that I got out of this, which is very important, is Keji, basically you're saying, Keji, what we should do is let the software of society develop. Well, what we are trying to do is hold the software of society constant, which is our culture, which is the way we do business, which is bringing religion into the economy and all those things. So we have not updated our software. And you say that in other countries, especially China, etc., they had updated the software. The Renaissance, they had updated the software. And there's a certain software that goes with industrialization and development. And this we don't have here. Then you propose that we should accept our role in the economy and kind of in the world, and accept the fact that in this day and age, we can't be a Mughal Empire or a Ottoman Empire, that we should accept our role, fit into the value chain, and try and move along as we go. But Sardar Sahab, our biggest problem is dealing with these issues. Our biggest problem is allowing a culture to change. We, in fact, want to hold back a culture. We don't want to change. So with that, will we ever be able to have development? And where do you think we can start, especially in a country where we really don't have a political discourse? Ji.
Thank you, Dr. Sahib. That's a very nice way of summarizing that. You first have to update your software, and only then would you able to get the dividend of that change in terms of the material improvement. Now, the evolution of Europe, particularly during the period of Enlightenment, it coalesced many ideals. The 3 most relevant being reason, humanism, and progress. Wherever you see development taking place, whether that is in Japan or the burst of development and change in Russia after the Bolshevik Revolution, or in China, you cannot get away from these 3 ideals of reason, humanism, and progress. This is the software that you're talking about. Now, the challenge for the rest of the society, including our society, is that can we distill these 3 ideals from our own religious, cultural, and historical past? I think we can, if we make the effort. Of course, there was a time when our culture, our civilization, and our faith was progressive. It had, many of the elements to learn from the nature and analyze the sensory data using the laws of logic, and then make progress. So if it can be done in the past, then it certainly can be done now. Now, if you try to impose these ideals of reason, humanism, progress as a product from the outside, then it is only natural for society to resist. But if you're able to derive these ideas from your own past, then the path is much easier. And I think it can be done. It's not easy, but it can be done. So we do have a chance, I think, Dr. Thank you very much.
Shahid Saab.
Ji, sir, thank you. Thank you for the nice presentation and a brief, nice overview of the world history. Brought me back to what I read, a lot of similar stuff in Guns, Germs, and Steel, and of course the recent one in *Sapiens* by Yuval Noah Harari. In fact, sorry, but my question is a brief one. It's about the role of technology and how it's going to shape the culture or the civilization, especially in the coming years. We've heard a lot about artificial intelligence and technology and the new technologies setting the bar high, setting the bar at different, and a lot of commentators who have been just like you've been watching history unfold, you've been reading about history, how it unfolded. They think that it's going to be something cataclysmic in the sense that it's going to what we talk about fourth industrial revolution and maybe beyond. The role of technology, they say that it's going to be tremendous. How do you see that changing, affecting the society as a whole and civilization as a whole?
Okay, thank you for the question, Chaisa. Technology cannot really lift the human condition of poor society. The working of this technology depends, as Dr. Saab said, upon a certain type of software. If the society does not have that software, it cannot really benefit from the technology. What I see the future of humanity, that humanity is going to be divided into a multi-civilizational world, not a multipolar world, but a multi-civilizational world. At the top, you would have industrialized countries who would be ruling the roost based upon their knowledge. And the difference between these countries and the rest of the countries was continued to grow. It was 1:4 by the time Adam Smith wrote Wealth and Poverty of Nation. By some estimates, the difference between the richest and the poorest country is now 1:250, and that will continue to rise. So technology would basically be created and put to the use of this system of civilization. Then you would have at the bottom societies that would be at the various stages of assimilating this technology, this worldview, these institutions, and based upon the level of assimilation and based upon their own internal strength, the coherence, the adherence to the rule of law, their own history, whether they have been together as a nation or not. So this combination of technology from the West and institutions from the West and their own strength of society would then have the second tier of civilizations in different gradient. And getting out of this quagmire and making the quantum leap to the really industrialized and advanced societies would be very difficult. And at the very bottom, you would have societies that are almost disappearing, that's still in the hunting-gathering state. So I see the future of humanity as multi-civilizational, in which technology would be created and be beneficial to only a small portion, and the rest would basically be dependent upon that small portion of the humanity for technology advancement and for the dole-outs. And we have already seen the emergence of this system of human civilizations. It's all only that we really have not been able to say it
Manjeet,
as such.
Raja
and
साहब वो
incorporate
बताएं.
that.
Sir, thank you very much. Very nice talk. Just a quick question. Where do you see the role or the outcome in terms of inequalities, which we see around the world, especially after the pandemic that has even exacerbated? So is that a cause or it's an outcome which is holding back the rest of the world to catch up with the other side of the world?
When humans changed to the industrial mode of production, at least the Western societies, they were producing more. And once you have more production, it is natural for inequality to rise. And that's what we see, the rise of inequality during the last 3 centuries, inequality among nations, inequality among classes, and inequality among individuals as well. Now, if you're able to plug into this universal civilization and system of production, which is truly global, the first truly global system of production, then it really does not matter whether you are where you are located geographically. You would be able to increase your per capita GDP. But even if you are physically located in one of the richest countries, but somehow you do not have the software, as Dr. Saab pointed out, and you cannot get plugged into these modern system of production, that while living in the same political system, you would fall down economically. And that's why you see the rise of inequality among the different classes of the same country. By some estimates, I've heard that the inequality among various parts of the United States is more than the inequality overall between United States and Mexico. So that really is not, I mean, it doesn't have any immediate causes, but the real cause is, again, structural, the nature of production in which humans have been engaged in the last 200 to 300 years.
Thank you, Siddharth Saab. That is wonderful. The only problem is that unfortunately, or yeah, maybe I should ask you this. Would the world system survive without inequality? Is it not written into our DNA that there will be inequality? And by sort of increasing the argument further, will some nations not always be poor and some nations richer? So I think this desire that we have, there should be absolute inequality, is in itself unnatural. There is inequality in the world, just like I keep saying, hey, I will not become Djokovic, no matter what I do. I just don't have the genes. The genes were given by Allah, not like I can't inherit them. So the issue is just this, that inequality is inherent. We try and solve the problem, but we make a mess of it. And globally also, there's inequality is inherent. And global economies will go towards inequality. What do you think?
I agree with you, Dr. 100%. I think we just have, set ourselves this goal of, reducing inequality. The only thing that you can distribute equitably is nothing. Only poverty can be distributed equitably. But once you are, when you begin to produce, it can never be distributed equitably. Maybe it can be distributed equally, but never equitably. And once you're producing more and more, it is only natural for the inequality to rise. And that's what we have seen over the last 300 years. I really do not see that being a threat to the world system. Look at, there are other, scholars pointing out that human condition has improved over the last 100 years or so. In terms of the per capita GDP, the decrease in violence, decrease in child mortality, and many other, social and health and income and education indicators as well. So overall, there is progress, but there's a progress with increasing inequality. Is that an unstable condition? Yes, politically, that does, pose problems. For example, in the United States, you have political equality and increasing economic inequality. Political equality, by that I mean one man, one vote. And economic inequality, of course, that we all know about. Now, how would the United States be able to deal with that problem before it become politically unstable? But that's a different challenge. The goal to have perfect equality and try to create utopia as the communists tried to do, I think that's illogical and this unnatural, and there is no point trying that. So I agree with you on that point completely.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Sardar Sahab. It has been a wonderful seminar. Great to engage with you. Please stay in touch. I think there's only one thing that we can share equitably, provided we are willing to. And the one country that is not willing to do that is Pakistan. One thing that we can share equitably in is in knowledge, because knowledge
That's
is
true,
available,
yes.
and knowledge does not, if I gain in knowledge, it doesn't decrease your knowledge. So knowledge is a public good that can be achieved by acquired by all. But like everything in the world, it requires some effort, some paying of a price. We don't want to gain knowledge. As a country, we don't want to gain knowledge, and I'll give you evidence that right now. How many people want to attend a webinar like this? I see this every day. And I see a country that is so hostile to knowledge. I see a country that is so sitting in the prehistoric era, not the Dark Ages, not the Renaissance. I see a country that wants to go back 5,000 years and live like beasts, but beasts in Land Rovers and beasts in all manner of luxury, except one thing, knowledge. I think that's an equation that can't be solved, and the solution does not exist. Unfortunately, beasts with Land Cruisers go nowhere. The rest of their relatives pay for them, and that's the society we live in. Thank you very much, Sardar Sahab. All the best. See you inshallah soon. Come over, let's have a cup of tea and chat. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Saab.